because we have this for years that eggs are bad because they increase your blood cholesterol. I want to hear your thoughts about revisiting this question about egg consumption and cardiovascular disease risk. How many eggs can you eat safely in a day?
It is possible for egg yolk consumption to adversely impact blood lipid profile by, for example, raising LDL cholesterol. The answer to that question is going to depend on the individual's propensity for experiencing adverse responses to dietary cholesterol. So there's kind of a range of responses: hyper response, non-response, hypo response. And so if the individual is worried about it, then they would have to get their blood levels checked if they're worried about it. And if they suspect they have some sort of familial connection with dyslipidemia, then that might be something to be wary of and stay on top of monitoring wise. If you happen to love consuming high cholesterol foods, for example, if you happen to love consuming egg yolks, then you probably should, just as a matter of careful practice, be aware of how that's impacting your blood lipids. So a little bit more direct question is, it is possible for egg yolk consumption to adversely impact blood lipid profile by, for example, raising LDL cholesterol. But that effect is, it's not as concerning as what might be the effect of consuming saturated fat from processed meats, or saturated fat from any number of other sources that could, at least according to the current evidence, have a stronger effect on raising cardiovascular disease risk. And so dietary cholesterol is a tricky thing. It is a tricky thing, especially in the form of eggs. And
now, let me ask you something quickly.
Yes, sure.
If we were to assume that the person has no necessarily greater risk around any dyslipidemia type of disease, or their cholesterol is normal when you look at their blood tests, would you say that if we were to sort of give a range or express some recommendations around, well, how much eggs can you eat? If a client comes to you and asks, how many eggs could I eat safely? And you know that the person is 100% fine at low risk of all these certain factors that we just mentioned.
Okay, so for that answer, we kind of go to the authoritative bodies. I don't love to do that all the time. I don't love to lean on necessarily expert opinion, but sometimes it's helpful to do that, at least just to have a kind of a general idea and a general guideline. So the American Heart Association, who some would argue is heavily lobbied by the egg industry, they give a green light to up to an egg a day for the general population. Yeah, and I do believe they have a little stipulation there for the older population who has a hard time getting in enough protein and stuff, then up to a couple of eggs a day for the elderly population, because it's an economic source of protein. It's a good source of protein. And you know what? So just as a general recommendation, I personally wouldn't worry about up to an egg a day for most individuals. I wouldn't worry about it. And
I have people that have like 5 or 6. I don't know.
Yeah, there are those people, and I would hope that anybody having more than 3 eggs a day would be kind of keeping an eye on how it might be impacting blood lipids.
Okay.
There is a fair amount of research showing up to 3 eggs a day is pretty innocuous, so it's just fine.
Okay.
And so, but the scientific consensus is afraid to recommend more than 1 egg a day. I can tell you, that I eat 4 eggs a day, maybe 4 or 5 days a week. So I maybe eat 20 eggs a week. whole eggs. And I'm healthy as a freaking horse. My blood work is awesome. So I'm one of those people who can do it, but I'm aware of how it impacts me. And
It's very independent. Yeah.
yes, yeah. That's
All right. Awesome.
That's the messy story about eggs and cholesterol.
Now, a very tricky question I kind of thought about. Maybe it's a little bit extreme or crazy, but what would be riskier? Diet very high in saturated fat, say coconut oil or high fatty meats, or a high intake of egg yolks?
Okay, that's a really tough question, and I don't think anybody really knows that question. But as a general answer, dietary cholesterol has a smaller effect on the risk for dyslipidemia than saturated fat as a group does. So yeah. So in theory, eggs would win in terms of the lower potential for risk. But with saturated fat, we have to go into the weeds a little bit and acknowledge that different sources of saturated fat have different effects on blood lipids and cardiovascular disease risk. And this is really kind of dependent on the so-called food matrix, the source of the saturated fat. So just as an example, dark chocolate is a saturated fat source. It's a pretty rich saturated fat source, yet the clinical effects of dark chocolate are largely positive, neutral to positive. Even full-fat dairy, another source of saturated fat. But when you look at the effects on blood lipids, it's neutral to positive. Now, butter, that's kind of a different story. But things like full-fat milk, full-fat yogurt, even full-fat cheese, neutral to positive effects on blood lipids. Now, if you were to take something like fatty red meat or processed meats, then you begin to see pretty consistently adverse effects on blood lipid profile. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in effects on blood lipids depending on the source of saturated fat. And even with something like coconut oil, even though coconut oil is a rich source of saturated fat, if it happens to be extra virgin coconut oil, there's about 5 or 6 studies worth looking at on the effects of coconut oil on blood lipids, of extra virgin coconut oil on blood lipids. And 4 out of the 5 studies show no effect on LDL cholesterol.
Okay.
Some of them show an increase in HDL, but it's controversial whether or not increases in HDL are something to worry about.